I don't know exactly how to start this video because it's a very deep topic and we're not really gonna be joking around here. I know I like to mix some of the comedy and the reality a lot of times to create sort of a fun mixture to keep people on their toes, but it's really not the occasion or season for that, as everything properly has its time and season. Now is more of a season and a time for deep contemplation. I'm being a little bit too over serious there, but yeah, there's not going to be as much joking around in this video, and hopefully I get off my chest what I want to get off my chest about recent events. And I have some notes, but I am going to try to also speak from the heart on some of these topics. So please forgive if it doesn't come off as the most structured and the most salient points and the most clear message. So yeah, this video is about the unfortunate death, the repose of Mr. Charlie Kirk in front of a crowd of what may have been thousands of people. I don't know if it was live streamed or anything like that, but it was certainly in front of very, very many people. A very traumatic event because of this. I know people like to say, well, there's been shootings where there's been hundreds of deaths, there's been much higher death tolls than this in an event. But that's not what this is about, and why it's such an important, in a sense, an important cultural event that ties us together for better and for worse. It's tying us together because it occurred in front of so many people. This was one man, but it was in front of more people than perhaps we've ever seen a death captured in front of before. I struggle to think of an assassination that's occurred in front of a larger crowd than this. The JFK assassination, very graphic, but that's captured on 60s quality cameras from what it seems to be just one or a couple or maybe even three angles or something. Not very many angles to that shooting, whereas this, we had from far away, we had from in the crowd, we had people taking pictures of the shooter before the shooting, unable to communicate that something was going on. It's very confusing, and of course the close-up shot being the most traumatic of all. The hyper reality really has kicked in. The panopticon, or whatever you want to call it, the surveillance of everything from our cameras, and then we have to live in it. The images being so realistic, and the more realistic that they are, the more burned into our psyche that they are. And for some reasons, it is actually probably good for us and for our salvation that this salvation as a people, that this has been burned into our memories. Because maybe then we'll actually do something to prevent these events from transpiring again. So yeah, another thing to comment is that this did happen in front of his family, his friends, and his fans, as well as some of his enemies, which nonetheless must have at least respected him to some extent to show up to an event like this. And for all of them, that is the most traumatizing thing, to see someone who is so, let's just say, loved, even by the people who wouldn't call it love necessarily, maybe admiration for some of those in the crowd, even if they would not admit to loving him in that sense. That shared grief is something which is hard to calculate. So Charlie was 31 years old, which is not, in the grand scheme of life, is not very old. He was just old enough to do so many great things and to achieve so much, but not old enough to fully enjoy the fruits of his labor. He had 2 children, and that's perhaps the most tragic thing about this, that he leaves behind 2 beautiful young children who he won't get to see them go through various life events. He won't get to see them graduate from middle school, from high school, from college. He won't get to see them be married. He won't get to see the very many great things that they will do. If he is watching from above, perhaps he will get to see those things, but really it's more than his loss, it's our loss. And his family won't get to have him there for these things that will hopefully his children will get to experience, which are positive things. His children for sure will not get to experience the sort of things that they would like to experience with him. And whether he was on the right wing or the left wing, that's a great human tragedy that if you can't consider that, I'm sorry, you're below human. You are something less than human. I relate to this on a personal level, not just to make this about me. I mean, I am, but that's what we do as human beings. We relate experiences to ourselves, for better or worse. It makes me think about how I lost my own father and how at least he got to experience me coming of age and becoming an adult, though I do think frequently about how he won't be there if I ever get married, if I ever go on through these life events in the future. And I feel for Charlie's children because they're going to have that sort of experience at some point in their life where they're not going to have their father with them. And please forgive me if that comes off as sort of egotistical, but nonetheless, I do genuinely feel some sort of relation to them in that aspect. So I do also want to get into some more heady, deep topics. In order to process this event, I know it's going to come off as a little bit lacking in sympathies, but I sort of wanted to front load the sympathies. I mean, as a man, what I'm going to do is I'm going to consider these events and what they mean for us as a culture, partially just as a way to process the event. I mean, it's something how men process grief is that they contextualize things and they try to figure out what they're going to mean for the future. Now, maybe that's not the most healthy thing, and maybe that's not what's ultimately the most necessary after such an event, but it's the way that we process things. We think, how could this be avoided in the future? What does this mean for the future? What does this mean about humanity and our struggles and our human condition? Maybe these things aren't the most important, actually, but nonetheless, it's part of how we process grief. So one thing I wanted to say is that I'm not saying this was necessarily a pre-planned event from the standpoint of a massive conspiracy, but nonetheless, I think of it as a sort of public death ritual. That's hard to say because it's such a horrific thing. Horrific's going to be in this video a lot. I mean, yeah, it's something that I tend to ponder, that what do these events mean for us? And one aspect of this being sort of a death ritual is that it's chilling how within the span of a week, a white woman and a white man were both killed on the public stage, and they were both, I believe, hit in the neck, which is, from a symbolic standpoint, it represents a human sacrifice. You know, sort of the pagans. I think you can look at the Mayans would have done this, or other cultures, going to the top of the ziggurat or the top of the altar and being stabbed in the neck and let to bleed out. I know that's very graphic, but that's just what happened historically, is that a stab in the neck is very, it lets out a lot of blood, for one. It's very graphic in that aspect, but it's also sort of a blood sacrifice. It has religious connotations to it. And I'm not saying that necessarily this was done on purpose or that this was necessarily centrally planned, but it's something of note that there is this connection. It's also hard to ignore that the fact that this sort of ritual murder occurred on a stage, it draws an obvious comparison to a death occurring on an altar, not a Christian altar, but a pagan altar with a human sacrifice. I don't think I have to explain to you how a stage sort of is analogous to an altar. I mean, it's at the center of everything, and often a stage is raised up, though this stage didn't seem to be very much raised up. It's still at the center of the crowd of the people who are gathered, and they're all facing the altar. And that this death occurred on the altar, not to get, super Pajot on all of you guys, but it symbolizes something, that this man has been sacrificed for something, and what has he been sacrificed for? And once again, this sacrifice not only being done in front of the audience at the event, being done in front of the virtual audience watching that footage afterwards. It's that we're all facing that altar and that we're all watching that sacrifice that makes this such an influential turning point in our culture, that we're all facing that altar and we all are left to wonder, what does this sacrifice mean? What is the context of this? Because man is a spiritual being, and he or she, whatever. Now's not the time for these gender politics, but he or she looking at the altar is left to wonder, what does this mean spiritually? It's not as important as the life of the man being lost, or as important as the family losing their father, but it certainly is of importance. It's of small importance to the individual, but of great importance spread over the collective. And I also heard a sort of fellow content creator, Anthony of Westgate, talking about how this is a sort of entering of a portal. It's an initiation. It's a moving forward into something else. It's sort of like 9/11, which was, obviously the next day. It's an initiation of, there was the world before and there was the world after. And for a very brief period, there was the world during, which was chaotic. And out of that chaos, we are transformed and transported into a new world that only exists after this event. Whereas we think of every other event in the day, I get my coffee, I get my newspaper, I go to work every day, I do these things. Life doesn't fundamentally change. Now, you enter into a temporary state of being, you go to work, you're at work, you go home, you're no longer at work. But such an event as this, you're permanently in the world after it, such as with 9/11, such as with the failed Trump assassination, luckily failed, of course. There's the world before and there's the world after. And on a small level, there's a bunch of events like this, and events that aren't as traumatic, but the more traumatic the event, the greater it is of a wall between the past and the future. The more traumatic, the more you can't go back and undo what has occurred. You can never undo anything, really, but there is no return and there is no getting back to the world before. You only get to a new world which exists after this event, for better or for worse.